Okay, we're back. We're back. Um, yeah, I'm just thinking back to the difference between attribution and giving somebody recognition for their work has, in a way, the ethos of attribution and seeking the provenance of our knowledge has very little to do with things like how many periods there are, or how many spaces there are after a period, or whether we're using sentence case or title case capitalization. And I feel like in some ways the minutiae, the technical aspects of citing and referencing get elevated, and the ethos of attribution gets minimized as a way of punishing students if they don't know the rules. So if we can rethink the idea of plagiarism as a way of insisting on attribution and thinking about this relationality of knowledge being in relation to one another and knowledge being beautiful, attribution becomes a joy rather than the mundane frustration of the technical aspects of citing and referencing. So these skills will remain no doubt important, but I think what I'm suggesting is that we stop punishing students for technical errors with citing and referencing, and instead, if focus on the ethos of attribution. So if a student has, for example, forgotten quotation marks, we can guide them formatively and say, you've forgotten your quotation marks here. This is one of our conventions, and I know that you didn't mean to dishonor the person whose work you're drawing from, so let's just put the quotation marks around it. How much kinder would that be then? You dock 20 marks for your APA errors. There are kinder, gentler, more compassionate ways to teach people the ethos of attribution. But finally, thinking about the ways where the definitions of plagiarism, historical definitions, may no longer apply because of some of the complexities and the shifting landscape. What I would like to say, when we think about post-plagiarism, is in our era in which our advanced technologies, our AI apps, are a normal part of life. But that doesn't mean that we always like them, that they are, or that they are unproblematic, that at least for the foreseeable future, I can't imagine that there would be a lack of problematization with these, that we should continue to think about the ethical constructs, and again, beyond what we've been able to talk about today, but that the ideas around punishment for lack of rule compliance for things like technical minutiae may need to give way if we want to have some deep understandings and conversations about the ethics of working with these AI apps. We're not there yet, I don't think. I think the jury is still out, but already what we are seeing is that these historical definitions of plagiarism and misconduct they may require questioning and consideration. Because the idea of the crime and punishment approach may actually not be helpful to students in terms of their learning. So let me ask you this, and I invite your participation in the chat here. What are some maybe timeless or evergreen ideas about integrity that we should keep? Because there's a lot about integrity, being whole, being respectful of others' work, that is worthwhile keeping. And what might we want to evolve or move away from? Because education develops, assessment develops, teaching and learning develops, and that things they don't always have to stay the way they were. So I mentioned last week that I was doing some work in Ireland and having conversations there with colleagues my age, some a little bit older, who told me that when they were in school, that corporal punishment was part of their everyday life when they were in elementary and secondary school, and they grew up with corporal punishment as part for misbehavior, so getting the strap or getting the cane. And I said, well, in Canada, I attended a school where we were taught by one nun who would come and smack the ruler on the desk. She wouldn't beat us. She would smack the ruler on the desk or the pointer on the desk, and it was enough to scare us and give us the idea that, oh yeah, no, it's something that there was kind of this act there. But for some people, punishment, physical punishment, is still part of their daily life or reality in their educational context. And that, I think, there's a little bit of a punishment hangover, if you will, when it comes to academic integrity and plagiarism. And what might, oh, you're getting some Foucault vibes now. Cool. Thank you for that. acknowledging where your ideas are seeded and blossom and grow, that's evergreen. That is phenomenal. Thank you for sharing that. Really appreciate it. So thinking about things like how might we move away from punishment in the same way that corporal punishment has been banned in many places now, but not all. So this is an evolution that's happened in educational systems. I like to think of a wraparound approach to academic integrity as a challenge to historical approaches where it was good guys and bad guys, or students against teachers, right? But if instead we put the students at the heart of what we're doing, holding them accountable for the decisions, holding them accountable for their behavior, but also recognizing responsibilities of educators to act ethically, and teaching assistants, and the institutional leaders for setting the expectations for integrity around policy. Of course, there will continue to be consequences for bad behavior. There's a misstep, we can correct the misstep. I'd like to suggest that we can do that in a way where we can preserve an individual's dignity, and that we might not necessarily have to make an assumption of them being a bad person. There will always be the outliers on the bell curve. Thinking about the role of professional staff in this, and professional staff have different roles in different places around academic integrity. And then bringing in that idea of academic integrity as a foundation for ethical decision-making in life. What might be the role of government ministries, industries, professional bodies, thinking about ethical decision-making in the professions. So we can take a little bit of a different approach to minimize these antagonistic or adversarial approaches. To do that, we might need to think about the ways that we address misconduct. I mean, it's sort of got these three sort of methods, traditional methods. One is a quite punitive method. It's basically a crime and punishment approach there. And there's some Foucault for you. The sanctions should be fair. They should fit the offense. There's a progressive discipline model. And what I mean by that is first offense, minimal punishment. Second and subsequent approaches get increasingly or more severe punishments, right? With the ultimate one being expulsion, called exclusion, depending where you are. But basically, when they've decided that you're so bad, you're beyond any help, and you must be ejected from the system. This is pretty easy to monitor and track, so institutions tend to like it because it's very transactional. And then there's another approach that often is layered on top, an educational approach where students may be offered remedial or rehabilitative workshops, academic remediation around citing, referencing, paraphrasing. Our university, for example, has a combination of this punitive and educational approach. And actually had a conversation with a previous vice provost from around policy because there was the possible sanctions or punishments that could result from a finding of academic misconduct. And one of those was mandatory workshops at the Student Success Center for citing and referencing. And I said, this is listed under some possible punishments for academic misconduct. But we're an institution of learning. In my opinion, under no circumstances should learning be a punishment. So I challenged her to reframe the language there to consequences or outcomes, that an outcome of a plagiarism finding, for example, could be mandatory attendance at a remediation workshop. Shouldn't be listed as a punishment. Taking a workshop and learning how to do something shouldn't be a punishment because you've been found responsible of misconduct. So even thinking about the language that we use while still holding people accountable. And more, there has been increasing interest around restorative resolutions and restorative practices, which is a more community-based approach seeking to repair harm in relationships. It's a more relational way to address misconduct. Also used in some legal and judicial systems, for example, in Canada. Doesn't work in all cases. An individual must be willing to take responsibility for their actions. So for those at the other end of the bell curve who are unwilling to take responsibility, a restorative resolution won't work. In that case, you may still need a punitive approach. So the idea of having different options available from an administrative perspective to address misconduct may help to cultivate students as whole, complete individuals. And the idea question posed in the chat here around accountability is of equal importance as building trust, but what does accountability look like? It can never be policing, but it's rooted more in care and consideration. Yes, thank you for this. I appreciate the comment. And one thing that really strikes me about a restorative resolution for an academic misconduct or non-academic misconduct is the idea that the ultimate outcome of that process might not be to eject someone from the system, because a restorative resolution starts with the question of what will it take to keep you in our system in a way that we can trust you and you can trust us and we can be together in community going forward. When you think about that, it turns the response to academic misconduct on its head. And instead of thinking about you must be punished, you must be excommunicated, to use culturally sensitive language there, but rather you are part of this community, you matter, we want you to continue to be part of this community, and we would like to work with you. And to do that, we will look at repairing the harm. So this is a resource-intensive approach. It requires funding for people to receive some training in different ways of approaching misconduct. It can be time-intensive, but it can also be, in the end, a more effective way to reduce repeat offenses and help to guide students sort of along the ethical decision-making as a practice to be built over time. Yes, and a great question here from Mahabali is, should we ever also turn around and ask, what does it take for our community to be more welcoming of you? This is an important question that I'm not sure I've ever heard in any North American context in the university around academic misconduct. So I will give you attribution, Maha, when I take your question forward and bring it into conversations with colleagues here. I think it's a really important question to think about the relationality there. So ultimately, when we're thinking about assessments and the roles that we can play with assessments, we do want assessments to be aligned with course outcomes and program goals, and in some cases, workforce needs. Now, my colleagues in the humanities find that objectionable, but that's fine. You can still take that out and think program goals as relating to societal expectations and the kinds of citizens that we would like our graduates to be. Of course, the parchment that they receive at the end needs to represent the learning that they've done. And for that to happen, then we know that if people have cheated their way through school or plagiarized, then they may not, it may not represent the learning. But to kind of think about the next evolution of all of this, colleagues are now starting to ask me about the ethics of AI-powered assessment tools. So I've heard colleagues say, well, if students can use ChatGPT for their essays, and that's maybe not plagiarism, maybe it is, how can I use AI assessment tools to evaluate my students? And I can say, I'm conflicted about this. There may be increased efficiencies in grading and feedback, especially with large classes. There may be potential for more frequent assessments as we have AI apps engage with us. If we're co-creating the writing, can we be co-creating assessment with AI? I'm struggling with this idea. I'd be interested to hear your ideas around it. Can AI help us with consistency across large groups, or provide sort of personalized learning paths for students based on assessment data and algorithms and outputs and analysis of that data? And is there 24/7 availability for our students? Because as educators, as human educators, we are not available 24/7, right? We need to sleep. And that we might have teacher reduced workload around assessment. These are some things that have come out in some of the literature that I've looked at, and we might be able to identify patterns in student performance that at scale, and then be able to address those. The jury's out for me in terms of the utility of AI-powered assessment tools and the ethics of that. My thinking may evolve. I'm hoping that as I sit with this and think with it more over time, and maybe have a chance to use some of the tools for assessment. And I don't work with large student groups, to be fair, right? I don't deal with mega lectures of 500 or 1,000 students at a time, because I teach mostly graduate courses and students. But my colleagues who teach the mega lectures have a tremendous burden on them in terms of the assessment and the amount of time. Is it possible that AI could help them with that? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that one. Right now, I can say that I'm struggling with it, but I can see if I'm thinking towards the future, 5 generations ahead, 2 generations ahead, 7 generations ahead, what role might AI be playing in terms of assessment for teaching and learning? That's a future that I can't yet possibly imagine, but I have a sense it's probably coming. So I wanted to put it on our radar today because as we're talking about academic integrity, it's another important piece when we think about the instructional ethics in the colorful, swirly donut of integrity. And will this be ethical for us as instructors? I'm not sure. But because I like to end on something practical after kind of the big, heavy abstract thinking and philosophical bits, some practical tips. I know we're just about at time, so maybe I won't go through them all, but I'll pull on a couple of threads that I think are my favorite and I try and practice in my own teaching, and it's to provide the clear guidelines around AI. And I know that folks here have heard this, have probably preached this before. And then also, I would say as well, encouraging open discussions about AI with with students about coursework, rather than simply saying you can or you can't, but engaging our students as partners in that dialogue, knowing that these tools may be part of their future. And then finally, creating that culture of integrity through positive reinforcement and what is okay, what is not okay, and that we are ultimately here to help you build your skills. So this is a little bit of thinking that I'm having right now around post-plagiarism. Some of the thoughts are incomplete and they're in process. And one of the things I really appreciate about engaging with communities like this is the ability to have conversations and learn with and from each of you. Maybe before I end, I'll just give a shameless plug for an upcoming, it's the Distinguished Research Lecture at the University of Calgary. This is considered a once in a career kind of talk that someone's invited to give. And this year I've been invited to give it. So we're going to look at different topics around global trends in education and AI. And you're welcome to join us. It's will be live streamed as well as in person. So I'll end there. And I think we have some time to chat, Maha. I'd welcome people to uh, engage in conversation as well. So maybe I'll let you guide me through those next steps.
Sure. So, folks, thank you so much, Sarah. This was amazing and always, always so rich and so many useful ideas in terms of actual practice, but also things to think about. And the chat has been quite active. If anybody would like to ask a question, I think you could go ahead and either raise your hand or type it in the chat, whatever you're more comfortable with. And if you don't have questions, let us know in the chat what stood out for you. Okay, so Huda wants to know, she'd love to hear your thoughts on how to shift the narrative to restoration and not punishment. And yeah, the link to the Workland Calgary
Uh,
talk or the conference in the chat too.
sure. Yeah, I'll pull the QR code up again where I'll maybe share some more thoughts on the restoration and not punishment. I will say, I mean, these are sometimes considered quite radical conversations, even on my own campus, as an advocate for academic integrity and asking my administration to possibly consider restorative approaches, because we're so entrenched somehow in these ideas that if we don't punish students for their misbehavior, that somehow like plagiarism becomes like a gateway to full-on corruption. And that may be true in very few cases, right? So the idea of like, we don't actually have an evidence base to support that in the research, right? That more often than not, it may be due to things such as circumstances. Maybe some of them are within students' control or outside students' control. And in my university, for example, we have priorities around decolonization and indigenization, and thinking about the ways that student conduct in colonized countries anyway is like the last bastion for decolonization. We talk about decolonizing the curriculum. We talk about decolonizing assessment and pedagogy. We haven't had very many conversations yet about decolonizing academic integrity. And I think it's a really important part of what we do, because so much of the punishment and I probably use this word is probably not the best choice of word, but I'm going to use it anyway. Like the violence that becomes integrated into our educational practices and taken for granted is something that I think the first step might be to just stop and question it. Like, do we really need it? And in terms of the plagiarism, of course, we want to hold students accountable. And there may be less violent ways of doing it. And so in more and more of the work I'm doing now, I'm focusing on things like human rights, which don't often factor into academic integrity policies. And the Council of Europe has a really great document around human rights by design for artificial intelligence. And it's about developing policies for artificial intelligence that take a human rights by design approach. And so at my university, I've also challenged us with our academic integrity policy, saying, how might we take a human rights by design approach? Because somehow it seems to be just taken for granted that we don't pay attention to students' dignity when there's a finding or an allegation of misconduct. And we just assume that if we're following procedural fairness and natural justice, that students may not find that humiliating. But in conversations with students, if they have been alleged of misconduct, the whole process can seem degrading and humiliating for them. And so the first step of, well, maybe one, asking students, what would they like to see? Knowing that, okay, the baseline is we're still going to hold misconduct, we're still going to hold people accountable for misconduct. But how can we do that in a way where we're preserving human dignity? That can be one place to start. So, okay, I'll stop sharing now, maybe. I hope that, I'm not sure if that answered your question, but those are some thoughts I had to share on it.
Let me see what else we have in the chat. Okay, someone's saying thanks for the amazing session, lots to ponder, and they'll watch the recording one more time. I will too. Sarah, are you willing to share your slides as well?
Yeah,
Or
you bet. I'll send those over.
awesome, thank you. And Amani's saying, looking forward to the day when grading is no longer required. Yes, please. I've been
Mhm.
trying to, I've been talking about this for so long. But constructive instructional feedback is given by an AI tutor. No, you're looking forward to that? Okay. Students can themselves generate AI feedback for their work based on provided rubrics. Yeah, and some have already been doing that and using that to help them improve before they submit. And they say it's been helping them. Depends on how good the rubric is, I think. The
Mm,
teacher role would be to teach, guide, mentor, support, role model, facilitate, engage students, scholars, research. Thank you, Amani. So it's not a
mm.
question. I was waiting for the question. Sorry, I didn't read it before I read it out loud. So, yeah. Okay, Caroline from my department, what are your thoughts about involving students in policy making, spreading awareness, and discussions around academic integrity?
Yeah, thanks for this question. At our university, we have student government representatives that would be involved in policy revision and development, so that there is student representation and student voice. And there's a great infographic. I'll see if I can find it and pop it in the chat. It's not about academic integrity, but it's about engaging students as partners. And it's from an organization called Student Voice Australia, I think it was called. Let me see if I can find it. And it talks about this student engagement continuum. Okay, I have a general link here, and it's now looks like it's defaulted to a different one. So I will put it here, and maybe someone can help me find the exact link now because it seems to have moved. But they have this great continuum where they talk about how to engage students as partners, right? And so like a less desirable way might be simply keeping students informed. It's a one-way directional thing where we inform students. And then at the other end of this continuum was where students are actively involved in the decision making. So I wonder what a policy around academic integrity that students got to design. And bring back to the administration, maybe as a first draft would look like. I don't know if a university, excuse me, that does that might be an interesting way to engage students. And we have every year we celebrate Academic Integrity Week, and we align it with the Carnegie Foundation's Global Ethics Day, which is the third Wednesday in October. And this year, one of our themes is, we have two themes, artificial intelligence is one, and engaging students as partners is the other. And we have students on our planning committee as well, and student-led activities, games, and things around understanding and demystifying what is academic integrity so students can learn from their peers rather than a top-down. I mean, professors and administrators may not see themselves as scary, but sometimes students do. So having students talk with one another about what's important to them, and even simple things like, hey, did you know we have a policy, and or did you also know we have resources to help you? And here's some places that you can get those resources, I think can be really helpful for students. So the more we can involve students, then I think we can exemplify that nothing about us without us.
Speaking of nothing about us without us, Mia was asking if you have a reference for the seven generations ahead thinking as an Indigenous tradition. Is this specific to a particular Canadian Indigenous group, or?
It actually it is throughout a number of different Indigenous cultures, but there was a resource from the University of Toronto called the Seven Grandfathers of Academic Integrity. Let me see if I can find it. And it's this idea of seven grandfathers, I think, behind us. And it was done by a woman by the name of Bonnie Maracle. And so I'll see if I can find, this is one resource that I like. So Toronto, of course, being, a few thousand kilometers to the east of us. And that might be helpful. And I think that the Seven Grandfathers teaching would be one place to start around that. And interestingly, this was the first resource that I became aware of in Canada around Indigenous views on academic integrity. And when I shared it with colleagues here, they said to me, they said, "Oh, it's good and it's useful, but it doesn't represent the Indigenous context of Western Canada." And so that led to conversations around how could we support the development of resources and knowledge around Western Canadian Indigenous nations' understanding of academic integrity. So that was Kita Glaju's project. So understanding that there are differences even within Indigenous cultures.
Thanks, Sarah. Sorry, some people are texting me privately, so yeah, Hood is saying we're getting there in terms of co-creation with students, going back to the earlier point. And Hood posted a link about the seven grandfathers, integrity. So did Galler. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that name correct.
Yeah, it looks like a few. Oh, there's also the eCampus Ontario one. Thank you for that. Yeah, it looks like we've got a couple of the PDFs shared there. Terrific.
Okay, thanks. All right. Do we have any more questions or comments, Sarah? Okay, I think we'll wrap this up now. Thank you as always. And I can't wait for the slides to dig back in. I took a lot of screenshots while you were talking, and I'm sure, and lots of ideas for my class too, not just on the institutional level, but like what kind of conversations I can have in class with my students.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me back. It's always a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'll make sure I send those slides through right away.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you everybody for joining us.
Bye.
Please take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.